Hey, good afternoon. 4:06 in the Twin Cities of Minneapolis and St. Paul, which includes the little suburbs around. You know, the Twin Cities always get the big billing, but you know, here in the Minneapolis St. Paul area, it includes other little towns, including a little town called Wayzata, whose high school put out the very famous Jake Faleschini, our favorite person of reason when it comes to the Supreme Court. Hey, Jake, thanks for being back with us today.
Hey, thanks so much for having me.
And we mentioned last week when we were talking off air that you're a Wayzata High School grad, and so it's good to see the Minnesotans doing something good in the world.
It's great that Minnesota's has such a great public education system, put out some wonderful people, including Senator Amy Klobuchar, that went to Wayzata High School as well.
Yeah, I was telling Brett, you know, I just come from that little Hopkins High School. Nobody's ever heard of that place, but a little place in between Minneapolis and Wayzata. You Wayzata folks consider that just sort of drive-through territory. I know, you know, it's like flyover country. It's drive-through. No, I'm just teasing. But Jake, now you're with the Center for American Progress and helping a lot of people pay attention to things that matter to them. And we had you on a week ago or so talking about Brett Kavanaugh as a Supreme Court nominee. And I have not stopped talking about what you said to us in that interview. I've said it to multiple people. I've been pushing since our conversation. Actually, I have dedicated much effort in my life, including a letter to the editor to the New York Times a couple of days ago that they were willing to publish last Friday about Brett Kavanaugh. And it really keyed off of your comments that Brett Kavanaugh is an outlier when it comes to Supreme Court nominees. And I mentioned this yesterday when we were having this conversation here, and I think it's really helpful to have you on again. And for conservatives and for other Republicans, they feel like he's an outlier because he's so exceptional. He's such a special person. He's gifted beyond all the others that have ever been gifted. It's almost as if they speak of him as somehow the blessed promised child of Supreme Court nominees.
Brett Kavanaugh.
Yeah, Brett Kavanaugh. But you have a different perspective on what makes Brett Kavanaugh an unusual candidate, and that was that he's the most political of all of them. Or I think you used the phrase the swampiest of all the Supreme Court justice nominees that we've seen in a very long time.
He is very, very swampy. That is absolutely a fact. I mean, comes from a D.C. lobbyist family and went to a elite private school here in D.C., same one that Justice Gorsuch went to. Then Yale Law School, then Yale Law School, D.C. clerkship, and then immediately started working as a partisan political operative just after that for the Ken Starr investigation.
So based on our conversation a week ago, I got my sails all full of wind, and yesterday I was blowing out some of that wind, trying to suggest that perhaps we should consider Supreme Court justices who come from a different background or flow than people who've worked in White Houses as staff lawyers or as administration lawyers. And I think that was true of Elizabeth Kagan. Is that right? She also did she have a similar job in a White House to what Brett Kavanaugh had?
She was a little bit different because she was the Solicitor General, so she was making arguments on behalf of the United States, not necessarily for the president.
So what do you think about this idea that when someone has played the kind of role that, frankly, you have to have lawyers that play the role of being the lawyer to an administration. You certainly want lawyers around. Certainly in the Trump administration, you'd want to have lawyers around. But does it seem unwise to have someone who's played such a political role then be nominated to be a Supreme Court nominee because it just taints the reputation or the sense of trust that people can have that a Supreme Court nominee is not a political operative?
I mean, certainly to the extent that Kavanaugh has worked as a partisan political operative definitely puts their independence, their ability to be a neutral and fair fact finder in any manner, fully into question. And one would hope that our justices are approaching the Constitution from a neutral standpoint, that they have, that they're not going into it as partisan political operatives. And I think the kind of background that especially Brett Kavanaugh has really just makes one question whether or not there's any way that he can reasonably fare and treat parties equally in front of the law. And that's what people expect of their judges, especially of the highest ranking judges in our country. And I think people are getting fed up with it. They're getting sick of it. And they're starting to see the court as just another political branch of government. And that's not good for anyone. That's not good for the country.
Yeah. Is there any pulling back from this at this point? I mean, I guess, and I don't know the history of the court well enough, I hear when people reflect back on significant court cases, they will reference that it was there'll be a chief justice who had been appointed by a particular president, and they'll refer to the court as a conservative or liberal court. Is there anything we can do to pull back from that kind of classification of the Supreme Court being just seen in the same terms as the legislative and executive branches in our political system?
Yeah, there are a couple of ways that we could do it. In the past, the court has checked its own power to get involved in political questions. That really started to change, quite honestly, under the liberal court of the 1950s and 1960s. That started to change. I guess now, folks question and wonder whether or not that was the right decision to start to tear down some of those barriers with the court getting more involved in what I think a lot of folks would consider more political questions.
Mm-hmm.
And there are ways that we can back off of that. There are reforms that, several academics and law professors have suggested to make to the court to try to neutralize some of its political ambitions. Erwin Chemerinsky had a really interesting proposal to set term limits for all the justices on a rotating basis so that it wasn't just random whether or not a president was able to appoint new justices, and would also set the the liberal or conservatism of the liberalness or conservatism of the court based on kind of the long-term overall control of the executive office by a party. And that might kind of tame, some of the politicking that happens with justices deciding when they might retire or decide to stay on the bench.
Yeah.
So those are some of the ideas that are out there. I mean, quite honestly, the justices can do it themselves by simply acting with a little bit more refrain. Mm-hmm. And I think what scares folks is that while conservative justices and conservatives have often spoken of the Supreme Court as one of liberal activism or one of liberals really using the court to achieve a set of policy objectives, over the last 30 years, it's really been conservatives that have been working to do that with the Supreme Court.
Oh, isn't
And while
that
they're still using the same frame of reference, talking about activist judges in an activist court, really the court and the activism is coming from the conservative direction right now, overruling decades of precedent, established laws, executive orders set by the president. I mean, it's a conservative activist court at this point, and could be even more so if there were to be a Justice Kavanaugh confirmed to the court.
There was this big conversation last week around how Kavanaugh had, in one of his rulings, I think it was a ruling about when he was on the district court, about the young girl who was in immigration custody and she was seeking to have an abortion. And he, in his dissent from the rest of the Ninth District, he wrote a line that involved the phrase of something like, while Roe versus Wade is current precedent. And there was a big thing, back before there were these allegations of his sexual assault of a classmate when he was in high school. That was the big question, was does he take precedent seriously enough, or when a district court judge is, what a lot of people have felt is applying for a Supreme Court nomination by the wording of his rulings, which is what I've heard some people refer to his particular ruling in that, or his particular comments in his dissent in that case. That this use of current precedent was really disturbing. Did you find that to be a disturbing phrase, knowing what you know about the Supreme Court and how you know that it functions? Do you think he was signaling something there?
Yeah, I absolutely think he was signaling something. And I think not surprisingly, right after that case is when he was added to Trump's list of, after that dissent, was when he was added to Trump's list of 25 potential Supreme Court justices. So he was definitely signaling something to the conservative activist movement, and that signal was read and perceived loud and clear, and then he was added to the list of potential justices for the Supreme Court because they are looking for activists. They are looking for people who will come in and reset what our idea of justice is in this country, what our fundamental rights and liberties are under the law and under the Constitution. And that really scares the hell out of me and should scare the hell out of a lot of your listeners, too.
That's Jake Faleschini. He is hell has been scared out of him. He's in Washington, D.C. We're in Minneapolis. But Jake, if you can hold on, I have so many questions for you about the Supreme Court. And if you do, too, give a call because Jake knows more about this than anyone you know. 952-946-6205 after the break. AM 950 Progressive Voice of Minnesota. Hey, welcome back. A little tutorial on the Supreme Court today with Jake Faleschini, who does his good work over at the Center for American Progress, and he's one of the experts on the Supreme Court. So, Jake, thanks for sticking around. Hey, okay, this is going to sound like a really rudimentary question, and so be gentle with me on me not knowing the answer to this. It's a little confusing to me sometimes, and I feel like I know this, and I know it is to people who don't pay a lot of attention. To how the Supreme Court sits in the overall governmental structure, because we've been told, and I say it here regularly, we have a legislative branch, an executive branch, and a judicial branch, and part of the problem in our society and in our conversations these days is that we keep talking about the Justice Department, and that the Justice Department is the one that investigates crimes and does all this, like seeking justice. And then you have the Supreme Court with the Supreme Court justices. And I think for some people, I don't mean to be overly rudimentary here, but it gets confusing about that the Supreme Court is a part of a separate branch of government, but the Justice Department, Rob Rosenstein is probably going to be fired in a couple of days, and the Attorney General, that's actually on the executive branch side. So can you just talk a little bit about how these are supposed to work and why it feels like the paths or the streams in these three distinct equal branches of government keep conflicting, and what the particular role of the Supreme Court is in all of that? Do you know what I mean? Do you see where that question's going?
Yeah, no, that's a great question, and honestly, I don't think I'd really understood. You spent a lot of time in law school actually going over this and figuring out how the different branches of government and the federal and state system work together. So that's a really good question.
Oh, good.
The Supreme Court of the United States sits as the most Supreme Court, or the most Supreme Court in the United States, and that means that when the Supreme Court interprets federal law in a particular way, or the federal Constitution in a particular way, that interpretation is set for all of the lower courts and also for the executive and legislative branches. So while the legislative branch of government, the Congress writes and passes the laws, and the executive branch enforces those laws, it is enforced according to the interpretation of the courts. And so all of your rights and liberties, all of the statutes that are written to protect you, all of the regulations that are put in place to keep your water and your air safe, and your prescription drugs from from being safe, that they're all of those laws and regulations are interpreted, can be interpreted by the Supreme Court. And then the Supreme Court also it intersects with state laws and state courts as well.
Mm-hmm.
But you're right that the Justice Department is different from the court system. The court system is the Supreme Court of the United States, the Courts of Appeals, and the District Courts of the United States. The Justice Department reports up to the Attorney General of the United States, who is the people's lawyer, and Rob Rosenstein is the second most powerful person in the Justice Department.
And so the Justice Department is, I mean, if someone were to take this to a local level, they would be akin to the police department and the prosecutors and the court.
Yes, absolutely.
And one of the things that a lot of people don't recognize, and I was arrested about a year and a half ago at a protest in Washington, D.C., and we had a court trial about it. And it became really clear to me, and sort of in lived experience, what I know is true, it's sort of on a structural level, and that is that the court that we sat before with the judge is one party, the arresting officers and prosecutors are a second party, and then me as the defendant is a third party. But what it feels like to an awful lot of people is that all of the government is on one side, and that the government includes the prosecutors, the arresting officers, or the Justice Department, and the court. That's what it feels like, is that that's all one group, the government, and then you as the defendant or the plaintiff are this other group. But there's actually these three, where the judge was saying to us repeatedly, hey, just to be clear here, I'm not on either one of your sides. I'm on the side of justice on behalf of the American people, and I'm supposed to be an arbiter of this process to care for it on behalf of both the prosecutor and the defendant. Do I have that?
And in a good system, the prosecutor will even be the first check on that, right? Where the prosecutor, questions whether the law enforcement that arrested you, the arresting officer, has the evidence that they need to actually even bring this up for prosecution in front of a judge to begin with. So hopefully in a well-functioning justice system, the prosecutor is the first check on the state's power, and then the judge is the second check on the state's power.
So this is what confuses me at the Supreme Court level, because if someone's making three columns in their mind, right, that you sort of have the people, and then you have the Justice Department and any of the prosecutors, any of the FBI or any of those arresting groups, and then you have the Supreme Court as the top of the whole judicial process. The President of the United States gets to appoint the people in the Justice Department and gets to nominate the people on the Supreme Court. So it feels like the president has his foot in both of those worlds, and we keep giving credit to presidents for the people that are on the Supreme Court. You know what I mean? We keep saying this person was appointed by this president, and therefore that makes them a conservative justice doing the bidding of the conservative, or a progressive or liberal justice doing the bidding of a progressive or liberal. Isn't it kind of a problem to just the American mentality that the president's got a foot in both of those, on both sides of that line?
Yeah, it is a very strange system that we have, and especially lifetime appointments. I think we're the only country in the world that does lifetime appointments to for our judgeships. And I recently had a conversation with some folks from other countries that were here, and we were speaking about the U.S. Judicial system, and they pointed out how strange that was. And it wasn't until I kind of stepped back and took a look at it in comparison to other systems of justice around the world that I realized just how unbelievably weird it is that we have these lifetime appointments to the federal bench,
and appointed by a president. And I'll tell you, I mean, part of my concern, honestly, is anyone that Donald Trump, because my opposition to Donald Trump's policies and the way he postures himself is just so pure. It just seems like that makes it very hard for me to really trust any kind of a justice that Donald Trump would appoint and that this Congress would confirm. And I don't feel good about that, right? I want to be someone who says, well, I disagree with this president, but I know that when the president's in this role or performing this duty, that it's different. And you've spooked me into believing that the Kavanaugh nomination in particular is not the kind of nomination that I should be drawing any solace from.
No, I'm very concerned about how partisan he is, and especially his views around presidential power. And if I were to pick the one reason why I think that Trump is really sticking with him right now, despite all of the problems that he has, despite his historically dissatisfaction with him being appointed, his disapproval ratings with the public, it is because of Trump is sticking with him because of his abnormal views around presidential power and the role that the courts have in checking that presidential power, which is to say, he believes that the courts have a minimal role in checking the president's power, and not all folks share that, and that also really scares me. I think that is the reason why he was picked by this president, and the reason why the president is sticking with him right now.
Jay, can you stick through one more commercial break, because Randy has a question for you, and I got to go to this commercial, but I also have one more for you as well. Are you comfortable sticking with us for another moment?
Absolutely, I'd be happy to.
Oh, great. Hey, we'll be back here after the break. AM 950, Progressive Voice of Minnesota.
Well, my soul checked out missing as I sat listening to the hours and necks ticking away.
Hey, welcome back. AM 950, the Progressive Voice of Minnesota. I just can't seem to let Jake Faleschini go. He's well, what is your job at the Center for American Progress? I always wonder how to call it. Are you do you work there? Are you a fellow? How do you guys organize yourselves over there at the Center for American Progress?
I do work here. I'm a full-time employee. I'm the director of courts programs at the Center for American Progress. So any issues relating to the courts, that's what I do.
And there's other people who have other roles at the Center for American Progress than being a director or being an employee. Are there different kinds of functions that people have?
Yeah, lots of folks here. So I believe we're the largest progressive think tank and action tank in Washington, D.C. There are 350 of us here. We have 20 different policy areas, from women's rights issues to international affairs to the courts to race and social justice, all sorts of different policy issues. And then lots of really amazing folks that work in communications and government affairs and help us get all of our work done, both in producing the ideas that we hope will become a reality and policy in our country, and then also in making sure that we're putting pressure on the right elected leaders to turn those ideas into action.
Yeah, great.
And actually improve the lives of real Americans.
Well, thank you for all that work. Randy from St. Cloud has a question for you about the Democrats and their connection to the Supreme Court.
Sure.
Yeah. Thanks for taking my question.
You bet, Randy.
Mainly, it's how incredibly meek and mild the Democrats keep being. And it's like, look at what the Republicans are doing. They put on young, total ideologues, and the Democrats put up, Merrick Garland, perfect example, the most milquetoast guy you could get. And they put him up because the assumption was that the Republicans would vote for him, which is a really stupid assumption to have. But they just, and Merrick Garland is also 62. So they put up older people and real kind of middle of the road, and that's why we keep getting beat.
Thanks, Randy. Jake, I think you get the question there. The conservatives, Randy's reminding us, they spend a lot of time thinking about Supreme Court nominees and justices and who's going to be in the stead for those, or in the line for those roles. all the way back to law school and beyond. It doesn't seem like progressives or Democrats do that. Is that true, or do we just hear about it from the work that's being done by the conservatives and Republicans?
Conservatives definitely have a deeper movement when it comes to the courts. They've been doing it for 30 to 40 years, starting with the Federalist Society and, the courts programs that are built into the Heritage Foundation and the Judicial Crisis Network, spending, millions of dollars a year promoting conservative judges at the state court level, building the bench all the way there, and then bringing them up through the federal pipeline. So, Randy's definitely correct that, conservatives have been thinking about this a long time, how they are going to take over the court system in the United States and make it a partisan project. And liberals, I think, have been operating in a different conception around the courts, wanting them to be fair, wanting them to be impartial, the way that a lot of Americans perceive of the court system and want the court system to be. And they're playing, asymmetric warfare when it comes to those different conceptions of what the court should be. And it's, led to the situation where we have right now, Brett Kavanaugh up for a vote in the Supreme Court, or for a position on the Supreme Court, with a kangaroo hearing on Thursday, being pushed through right-wing media sources, having the media and senators, and the President of the United States denigrating women who have accused him very credibly of sexual assault, sexual harassment, just absolutely inappropriate activity. But he's, their golden boy who's been brought up through this pipeline from the time he was very young, and they are, reticent to let him go. And I'm very worried about what's going to happen at this hearing on Thursday.
So you're working, as the director of courts programs at the Center for American Progress. There's you, and then that list of people and projects and monies that you described that are on the conservative side for how they're going to get their candidates into these judgeships seems so massive. It's you got a David and Goliath thing going on over there. It's all of that, and kind of versus Jake is what it seems like.
It's not just me, though. I have some fantastic colleagues here at the Center for American Progress who, help me every day on this work, and great colleagues outside of the Center for American Progress. Folks at the Leadership Conference for Civil and Human Rights, at the Alliance for Justice, at the American Constitution Society. And then all of our partners and allies in the LGBTQ movement, the women's rights movement, the labor movement. So, it's a broad coalition of effort. Folks that are, we're definitely fighting. It is still a David and Goliath situation. They have much more money than we do. They have, a lot more infrastructure that's been built up over time. But we have, hopefully, the truth on our side, and we have the people, feeling that, they truly want a justice system that serves justice, that understands the rights and liberties that are built into our Constitution, and aren't going to let those be erased, by conservative activist judges who want to pretend that those rights simply don't exist, or weren't, ratified again during, subsequent periods of our foundational history. And updating of our Constitution over time with new amendments. And we're trying to realize those rights. And, hopefully the people agree with us, even though, we don't necessarily have the power and the money on our side to push it out there all the time. And that's why it's so important that you have people on the radio to talk about it. So I really appreciate being given the opportunity to talk directly to your listeners about the importance of this work.
Yeah, well, thanks. I think it is as well. And there's not a lot of weeks in 5 years that you get to talk about a Supreme Court nominee. There's a couple of weeks, right? Like, they don't come up all that often. And when they do, they're kind of not all that interesting to most people, right? This one has captured people's attention for a number of reasons, things that you brought up before a lot of us were paying attention, that Kavanaugh's out of the norm, even for Supreme Court justices that might have a partisan backing behind them because of which president has nominated them. Even at that level, he's out of the norm. And then there was these allegations of his behavior. How appropriate do you think it is in the work that you do studying the court to start going back into people's lives 30 years ago into particular incidents and to bring those up in the Supreme Court nomination process? I bring that up because not because I question if it's appropriate. I just want to be clear about this. But I've heard a number of people, whether on both sides of their belief of whether they believe Brett Kavanaugh's denials or not, they just say, I don't know that. Is it appropriate to bring up these kinds of issues and what he wrote in a yearbook back in high school at this level? Shouldn't people have been vetted already to this point, and shouldn't we trust in this? We had Randy from a different Randy call in yesterday and basically said, look, he's been through the ringer 6 different times by the FBI. You can't just keep going back earlier and earlier into someone's life. What's your view on that approach about how far back into someone's life we should go when we're looking at a Supreme Court nominee?
It's a great question. So I don't think it's just about what happened. It's about his subsequent statements and whether or not he told the truth about them. And the people should definitely be worried if, we have a person who's been appointed to a lifetime position on the most powerful court in the entire country who will be interpreting their rights and liberties underneath both the Constitution and all federal statutes for the rest of the time that he wants that position. If he has lied to the people about his record, about his history, the way that he treats the people around him, and whether or not he then has lied in subsequent proceedings and conversations with the FBI and in on the record under penalty of perjury to senators. And I think the people should be extremely concerned about that. The first allegation was from an incident, and that was the allegation brought by Dr. Blasey Ford, was about an incident that took place in high school when he was 17 years old. And for folks that question whether or not that should trail with him for his life, I have only one question. Do you believe that every black or brown man that has been arrested for something that they did when they were 17 or 18 years old should just be released from prison for that? Because that doesn't seem to be the general position of conservatives or the Republican Party.
Great question. Yeah.
They seem to be very tough on crime when it comes to young black and brown men committing crimes. But then, then here this should be excused, and it should just be something that he did when he was young. That seems very convenient to only apply that in this particular situation. And then the second allegation was something that took place while he was in college, and he was specifically asked on the record by Senator Hirono whether or not he had done anything illegal or committed any acts of sexual impropriety or harassment from the time that he was an adult, and he said no on the record to Senator Hirono. So that would call into question the accuracy of that statement as well. So I think obviously the things that we do when we're younger should carry less weight. I want to believe that people are able to be reformed, but being reformed carries a level of contrition with it, or a precondition of contrition, and admitting that what you did was wrong and admitting to the mistake that you made, and none of that seems to be evident here. If these allegations are right, and I'm inclined to believe the credibility of these women, of these survivors.
That's Jake Faleschini. He works as the director of courts for the Center for American Progress. Jake, I really appreciate this. I'm just going to ask you one more. We're kind of out of time, so it's have to be a quick one. But do you now have a current sense if Brett Kavanaugh is going to be confirmed as a justice on the U.S. Supreme Court?
I don't. I am going to be watching
up in the air,
on the edge of my seat, the edge of my seat, like I think all all Americans will be, hopefully this Thursday, listening to these incredibly brave women tell their stories, and hopefully their allegations will be taken seriously. And I hope that they are, that that senators really listen and have learned from the mistakes of the Anita Hill hearing, and have learned from the mistakes of the past to truly believe women when they say that they have suffered these injustices at the hands of men.
Well, Jake, thank you so much. I really appreciate it. I look forward to having you on again. Thanks.
My pleasure. Thank you so much.
Hey, this is AM 950, Progressive Voice of Minnesota. We'll be back after the break. I still think my favorite part about doing this radio show is the bumper music. Thanks, Brett. Appreciate it. Hey, 451.
Who was the guy that sent that bumper music, too? He did a nice job, didn't he?
Yeah, he sure did. I got a whole other set for you. I've realized I need to update that because there's just so many good sounds that we should do.
Oh, exactly. I agree with you. Yeah.
Hey, speaking of good sounds, did you get that little clip that I sent you earlier about with Donald Trump? Were you able to see that one?
Yeah, give me 2 seconds.
Okay, all right. I just want to set it up if you've got it. So apparently the president of these United States of America had to play the role of being someone who speaks to other people who are world leaders. And one of the ways that happens, of course, in the United States of America is that the president goes and speaks to the United Nations, the great collection of the nations that unite together to do a whole set of projects around the world. And it's an esteemed group. Not perfect, of course not. Not always fulfilling its stated desires and its potential, absolutely. But it's a pretty good group of people. So the president's there today, and he has to read off of a teleprompter. And he was in his opening sentence, opening bit here, which I think runs about a minute 20 seconds long. In his first 5 sentences, the people in the audience start to chuckle, and then they start to laugh. They just laugh out loud at him. He realizes they're laughing at him and not laughing with him, and then has to say, well, that's not really the reaction I was hoping for. And then he starts laughing. Like, he outs himself as being a total, fraud, just reading lines off of the teleprompter like he's just hitting a script that some TV producer told him to say. It was you should watch the video. Find it on you can find it on lots of places on the internet, and it'll probably be all over the news tonight, because it's just if you've ever thought that this guy is not only dangerous, which he is, that his administration is hapless to do the right things in this country and is fully competent to do things that bring harm to people, but if you thought that he's truly just mocking the entire project of there being a president of the United States, I think it couldn't be any more clear here. All right, Brett. So you think we got it, so we can at least hear the audio bit?
Yeah, I'll go a little ways into it, so we don't have to listen to the entire thing, because there's only so much of Trump you can take.
Oh, there's so much, and he talks so slow, and he's clearly reading this thing, and he's trying to add drama. And anyway, he's just a terrible line reader. Like, if he was.
And a quick note before going into this too, because I heard this as well. Even though the laughter sounds kind of faint, keep in mind this is only coming through on Trump's mic, so it was probably a lot louder in that room, since they obviously didn't have a boom mic on this as they were going.
Good point. This is just what's being picked up on the microphone pointing away from the people.
Yeah. Here we go.
Today I stand before the United Nations General Assembly.
And he sounds drunk,
to share the extraordinary progress we've made. In less than 2 years, my administration has accomplished more than almost any administration in the history of our country. America's so true. Didn't expect that reaction, but that's okay.
So there it is. My administration has accomplished more. I mean, he just lets out this BS line again. about his administration, and the people in the room just start laughing. And then he pauses and says, "No, it's so true. It's really true." And that's his tell. Whenever Trump goes off script and reinforces something with some little statement of how true it is, couldn't be more true, the most lovely person, the most beautiful this, that's when he's bluffing. He's the worst poker player in the world. And so the people then just start laughing at him like, you are ridiculous. For the president of the United States, first of all, to stand up in front of the United Nations and start bragging about what a great job he's doing, ridiculous. And then the people realize none of that is true. It's just beyond comical. So people, many for whom the ins and outs of following this president is not their normal pattern, some of whom don't even use English as their first language, they know when a guy just making stuff up. And then he goes on in this speech. It gets worse from there, from the punchlines and from the laugh jokes to this most dystopian, dark version of how the United States is going to be involved with the United Nations. The guy's like some 2-bit thug that's in there trying to say to the United Nations, if you give us something, then we'll work with you. Basically, United Nations, we're now on a quid pro quo relationship. For all the people who have said for 8 years during the Obama presidency that he coddles our enemies and that he down talks the United States of America, you have got to have some level of courage to say what this President Trump is doing is demeaning the very leadership of this country. To say to the United Nations, not that the United States of America is proud to lead. We want our values. We want our commitments. We want our passions to be aligned with the passions and the commitments and the energies of other people around the world to accomplish the things that we think matter in this world. Instead of saying that, he gets in there like he's negotiating at some sort of a bingo fundraiser. It is from laughable to just head shaking. So the reviews of the President of the United States today at the United Nations, well, last year he's over there blowing off all this like little rocket man nonsense. And this year he's trying to brag about everything he's done and getting giggled and laughed at, and then goes into some sort of a renegotiation of the role of the United States of America. It's unbelievable. Look, you've got to vote for the governor. You've got to vote for senators. You've got to vote for people in the state house. You've got to vote for state senators. You've got to vote for a congressperson this year and tell it to all your friends. This president needs to be restrained. This president needs to be confined. There is a way you do that. It happens on November 6th, and that's the time to turn out. AM 950, Progressive Voice of Minnesota. Hang in there, everybody. I'll talk to you tomorrow.